Okay, hello and welcome to this webinar, Turn Purpose into Practice, Embrace the New Infrastructure of Patient Centricity. My name is Mike Ward and I'm the Global Head of Healthcare and Life Sciences Thought Leadership at Clarivate. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator of today's discussion, which, given the fact that we have more than 800 registrants, is clearly a popular one. As you will be aware, most pharma and biotech companies have somewhere in their mission statement a declared commitment to put the patient at the center of everything they do. Indeed, an analysis of company statements and press releases by my colleagues at Clarivate confirms that there has been a massive uptick in activity that highlights the increased focus in not only listening to patients, but actually ensuring that they are also being heard. Indeed, in the past 5 years alone, there's been a more than doubling of the volume of such activity. So the purpose of today's webinar is to explore how companies, whatever their size, can pursue meaningful and sustainable engagement with patients across the whole timeline of the medicine's discovery, development, and delivery timeline. So over the next 50 minutes or so, we'll seek to understand the most common challenges associated with implementing a patient-focused culture, determine which key activities or processes need to be established to ensure both the creation and delivery of that patient-centric culture, identify meaningful key performance indicators that can help benchmark success and ensure that the patient voice is being heard, and also to show how, or to demonstrate how, true patient centricity can generate a return on investment. So to help me in this quest, I'm delighted to be joined by today's panelists. They are Daniel De Schrijver, who's a patient engagement and advocacy lead MEA at Janssen, Vanessa Pott, who's Director, Global Patient Insights and Advocacy Healthcare Business at Merck KGaA, Wills Hughes Wilson, Chief Patient Access and Commercial Planning at Mereo Biopharma Group, and George Garibaldi, the Chief Medical Officer of Noema Pharma AG. So as you can sort of see, that we've got representatives from the some of the largest companies to some of the sort of the small agile startups. So thank you to the panel for agreeing to participate and share your thoughts and observations. So before we actually start the discussion, I just want to remind the audience that you too have an opportunity to participate, to ask questions, and this can be done through the Q&A function that you should be able to see on your screens. So please put your screens in that channel, and I will try to weave them into the conversation as we go along, or alternatively, if we've got time at the end, to pose those questions then. Also, any questions that we're unable to address today, we will endeavor to get the answers to you after the event. So if you see my eyes dancing around furtively, it's because I'm looking at both the chat box and also the Q&A, as well as listening intently to my guests. So to kick off proceedings, I'd first like each of the panelists to describe for them what patient centricity looks like in their companies, and also give us a sort of a brief insight into how the roles they have encourages and promotes patient engagement within their companies. So Daniel, if you could kindly kick off.
Yes, thanks, Mike. Well, you already mentioned it. I think most companies have patients in their mission statement. And Johnson & Johnson, we have a credo that was written in 1943 that says our first responsibility goes to patients and everybody who uses our products, our second to our employees, our third to the society we work in. And if we do these things well, our shareholders will get a fair return. So you can see that ever since then, we can officially say we have been clearly working for patients. And I think most companies who are in healthcare are doing this because they are the end user of the solutions we bring. However, what has changed over the last, and I would say probably 20 years, but that has come to more of a climax the last years, is that we are moving away from doing things for patients to do things with patients. And with patients, I mean everybody who lives with a condition that needs a treatment. And doing things with patients means it's a more collaborative approach, it's more partnerships, it's co-creation. My role here in the company is to facilitate this, because our main objective is not to say we have a department patient affairs. We want patient engagement to be everybody's responsibility, whatever their functions are. And therefore, my role is, and with my team, of course, is to create the right processes, the right tools, and of course, the right mindset for people to be able to engage with patients and to co-create the solutions.
All right, thanks very much, Daniel. Vanessa.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to build on that. At Merck KGaA, we actually are challenging the terminology a little bit. So I'd like to start on a controversial note here. Rather than speaking about patient centricity, we have now coined the term patient-directed. So we are actually striving to become the most patient-directed healthcare company. And I know it's just semantics, but I would like to explain a little bit what we mean by that. So for us, our team is actually relatively new. We were established 5 years ago. So I think in line with the observations that you shared in your intro. And we came together to look at what was already the status quo at the company at the time. And of course, there were already patient engagement activities taking place. But the specific emphasis that we now as a centralized patient insights and advocacy team are putting on this is that we're really aiming to hold everyone accountable from early research through development into the post-commercialization space to make sure that our behaviors and our processes are ultimately really being directed by the insights that we get from patients and carers, so that we listen as a first step, but that we then act upon that and that there is a measurable impact. So this is really the stance or the lens, I could say, that we're taking at Merck KGaA. It's not necessarily different from what Danny was saying. It's just a sort of a unique way of making sure that everyone keeps thinking about the impacts at the end of the day.
Right, yeah. And I think some of the points we will return to in today's discussion. Wills.
Yeah, so thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. There are a lot of similarities we've just heard from Daniel and Vanessa. I think the most important thing is that it's going to look different company by company how it's rolled out, but the direction is the most important thing. So clearly, the difference between a 100-year-old company or a 70-year-old company, Daniel's and Vanessa's, is going to look very different in comparison to a young company like Mereo that is, say, 5 years old. So it's a new build where we can make real our vision of the patient-driven approach. We're hiring, we can build. And so you can also make it part of how you interview, who you hire, and then also what you go on to reward. So I think there are different stages in a company's development. That means that you can roll out your patient-driven approach in a different way. The other thing I was reflecting on is that in rare diseases, it's often a situation where you have no therapeutic option. We're often pioneering together. So the therapeutic area you're involved in can often be one of the elements of how a patient-driven approach may roll out and become a reality. In rare diseases where you may have no other therapeutic option, we're often pioneering together. So we really do need everyone on board. And it's a genuine need to engage with the key community if we're going to be successful to move forward as a business, but also to develop a meaningful therapy. So what I'm thinking about is no matter how big or small, how new or old, we're all seeing the same goal, and how we roll it out will be tailored on a case-by-case basis. And that's something that I've picked up as we move forward in the preparations for these talks.
And George.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for being here today, on participants and attendees. Look, I'm personally blessed by being part of a team that believes in the vital importance of engaging and integrating patients in every step of the process of drug development all the way to the end. We do not have a specific group or department for patient engagement. We are all of us ambassadors of patients. So at Noema is less than a year old. So it's really the youngest of all here. My personal role is to the integration of all stakeholders, including patients, both internal and external stakeholders. As you can imagine, in such small companies, time is extremely precious, and everybody has always like in mind what is absolutely needed, what is visible. And sometimes engaging with patients or thinking about patients may not come as the first priority. So my role is to make sure that we always keeping patients in mind from the beginning, from the very, very beginning, including external partners, development partners, CROs, making sure that they understand that what we're doing at the end of the day, even though we may spend an additional effort or many additional efforts to create novel outcomes, to the point that Willis was mentioning, when you are in a world of orphan diseases, well, many of the clinical outcomes that are out there are not relevant to our population. So you have to go back to the scoring board, sit down with patients, understand what they're looking for, understanding what they're struggling with, and then come back and integrating everything in what we're doing. And I'll give a couple of examples later. The other challenge is obviously regulators. Regulators do not have necessarily always patients in the radar screen. They like in general to follow the paved path. And that's an issue that sometimes puts patients on the side. So we have to maintain our faith with the regulators to tell them, you know, this is the feedback we got from patients. This is why we're doing it this way. And then finally, and last but not least, the importance of reminding clinicians, and I'm one of them, that what they believe patients want is different from what patients really want. And unless we ask them the question, we would be always wrong.
Yeah, that's some great food for thought there, George. Thanks very much. At Clarivate, I mean, we've got interested in patient centricity, and it's an initiative that we're driving. And as part of the sort of the research for our efforts, you know, we've sort of held other events, and at one of those events we had sort of patient advocacy groups under the sort of the title "What Patients Want," and a sort of a clear message that came out of that was they wanted the relationship to be authentic. So I thought that, you know, having heard that from patients, it would be great to go to the sort of the pharma and the biopharma partners and sort of say, right, okay, how can companies ensure that the engagement they're having with patients isn't sort of some PR exercise, but actually is recognized by the patients as being authentic. So Wills, I'm going to sort of throw the gauntlet down to you first.
Thanks, Mike. And you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. It has to be genuine. It can absolutely not be a PR exercise. So a couple of thoughts then on that. I think the first thing, if you're engaging with your patient community and remembering they may not want to be referred to as patients. So I think, again, taking the cue from how your community wants to be referred to and how they talk about themselves. So if you're engaging, you need to be listening and you need to be ready to hear what you're being told. So if you ask the question, you can't be afraid of the answer. And when you take the stuff back into your organization, whether it's on the clinical trial or your value package or whatever it might be ready to take that on board and then to feed back to the community that have taken the time to give you essentially free advice. And if you're following what they've said, tell them. And if you're not, you also have to be very, very clear and say, look, we've heard what you've said. we weren't able to do that, and here's the reason why, and maybe be ready to work through something else. So I think that's the first thing. It can't just be, you only hear what you want to hear. The second thing, and I think that builds on what George was saying, it's not the job, like a role of one person, what we would argue. Drugs take time to develop over years, and there are many functions and roles throughout the whole process. So a truly patient-centric approach means that this is everybody's job. And that means whether it's trial design, information, patient leaflets, engagement, pricing, reimbursement, even down to the packaging, and we can talk about that later maybe if we have time. It's really a continuum, and having that voice, that collaboration, that dialogue at every stage is really important. And the third thing I would say is that it needs to come from the top. So at Mereo, we have regularly people coming in from the communities we seek to serve, pre-COVID, obviously, to make sure that all of us, no matter where we are, where we sit, which program we work in, really understand from firsthand what's important to the communities we're seeking to serve. And that needs to come from the top. It needs to be a leadership role. That needs to come from the CEO and all of the leadership team, and then all of the individual leaders in the company. And I think those three things would really say that this is authentic and not just a PR exercise.
Right. So I mean, it's interesting, Wells, but because of course, because of the sort of the focus of your company and sort of the size and the age, that one might sort of think that it's possible to be that sort of that agile. So Daniel, you mentioned that was it 1943 that the Credo was first written down. How do you ensure that your engagement with patients is authentic?
Well, I think you use the word relationship, Mike, and actually relationship already says it. It's a partnership, and it's a partnership which is an ongoing relationship. So we are not going to be in and out because we need some information or we will provide some answers. It is a relationship. That means you are building something together. You are co-creating that solution that will eventually help someone or many people to better live their lives. That is something you have to co-create, and that means, yes, you have to have all what Will's already said. You have to have these feedback loops. You have to be honest and be able to say, okay, we couldn't manage to do all the things you asked us to do, but this is how far we can go. And I think if this is an ongoing partnership, that definitely leads to win-win, and it's actually win-win-win because society wins. We'll come back to that later. I believe that is authentic. We should not, I don't think it can be less than being an authentic partnership. If not, it's not going to work.
Yeah, and Vanessa, I'm going to come to you, and then
yeah, I mean, a lot of good points already raised by Wills and Danny, but I just wanted to go back to one specific point that Will said about the honest dialogue. And I think this also is really important, that we also explain our decision making early on. So why are we investing, for example, in a certain indication area? Why are we moving forward in one indication, not another? Because now that we're talking about, and I think I'm hopefully preaching to the choir here, we have a very strong tendency now, wherever you go in the context of patient centricity, you will read that it has to happen earlier. The engagement has to happen at the earliest stages of research and development. So this means actually not to just present a finished trial design and show it to the patient community and say, oh, here, what you think. It obviously means at a much earlier stage, well, also the likelihood of actually going ahead in a certain indication with a certain program is going to be reduced. That is just simply the nature of how R&D works. So therefore, this really brings an obligation to communicate clearly, transparently, and fairly around the decisions that we make as an industry. And I think we all should think a little bit more in that direction and not fear those conversations, because I think through those honest, and it's the partnership that Danny was alluding to, through those honest conversations, that is how we build authenticity, and where we shouldn't shy away from involving patient communities at such early stages just for fear of them not being able to follow through or overpromise. I think that's a little bit of a patronizing approach, actually, in believing that patient organizations would not be able to cope with such decisions.
Yeah. So I think this is sort of a good point. We've had a question from the audience, and I'd like to remind the audience that if you have a question, shove it in the Q&A chat box, and I'll try and pull it in at the appropriate moment. And I think this is the appropriate moment. And it's you were talking about sort of patient engagement, etc. And I'm going to put this question to George first, but then maybe Wills and Daniel would like to comment as well. And that's around ensuring, how do you ensure that the patients that you're actually engaging with, the patient input that you're actually getting is genuinely representative? How do you identify which patients are going to be useful to that process? So George, I'll kick off with you.
Well, I'll start with this statement. All patients are insightful, absolutely all of them. It's the question is about how to reach out to patients in general. And there are a number of, we need to be as inclusive as possible. Let me challenge everybody. When car makers design a new car, they go to their end users and ask them what they think. When we as pharma design a new therapy, what do? We go to physicians and ask them what they think. Well, they are not the ones who are going to use. They're going to the ones who are going to make a decision in conjunction with patients. So with that said, I would just mention a long list of patients or ways to reach out to patients that are going to give us the insights, share with us what they're struggling with. Patient associations. I have personally a very great experience for the last year with the Tuberous Sclerosis Association, that organized for me meetings with parents of kids with tuberous sclerosis, where these were the most insightful meetings I've ever had as a physician and as a trialist. In addition to this, sitting down and getting through social media. I've been invited and I'm honored by being part of the Patient Pain Association website, where this is a chat room where patients share what they're facing every day. And it has been a year now where every day we learn something new. I encourage the entire team to be on board as well, to hear firsthand what patients think. So these are different ways. Social media clearly today have empowered patients to share what they want, to share with us also what they're looking for. And then we need to integrate all this in our research. Geography is an important aspect that we keep always, maybe putting on the side. The patients who are sitting in Germany or in Spain or in the US or in Colombia are all of them experiencing very valuable, I'd say, or can share with us very valuable insights. We need to reach out globally because the relationship as well between patients and their medicines is completely different based on the geography, the economical status, and so on. These are all extremely important. That's why I'll concur with all the panelists on one thing. There's absolutely need to have this part as part of our daily behavior and thinking. It's not a task, it's not a tick box. We have to think, what would the patient think when I'm designing a study this way? How would they get through all this burden? If I would be a patient, would I do this? Keep in mind something. We have all of us been patients one day. We have all of us had this experience directly and indirectly with family members and friends. What do we think? And what did we think? And what do we think today?
Yeah, no, so it's good points. Wills, with a rare disease focused, and just because of the sort of the nature of those, is it easier for companies such as yourselves to identify this sort of the appropriate people to talk to?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I hear very often that it can be easier in rare diseases because they have established rare disease patient groups, And I think that's the case in some rare diseases. At the same time, I believe it's really important not to fall into the trap of lumping in the same way that George was saying, you know, looking culturally that everyone's the same and everything's the same. But looking at rare diseases, it's not a homogeneous group. Not all rare diseases are the same. And I believe it's really important to really do the listening that George and Danny and Vanessa have been talking about, to really try and understand what's important for the group. So a rare disease where people live to an older age and where you may be looking at chronic treatment is going to have a very different dynamic than a rare disease where, sadly, and there are many, where it manifests in pediatric patients and they don't live long. And so who you talk to then becomes extremely important. And so it really needs to be a tailored approach. So I believe that trying to understand what the community might look like and then how you could support that will be important. And just linking to what George was saying, this idea about culture, in some rare diseases, it may not be the physician that you need to talk with. It may be a nurse community, or it may be a physiotherapist. And so understanding who are the real interlocutors, who are the people that are really listening to the people with the rare condition, and then if that varies according to where you are on the globe. The last thing I would say though, Mike, on rare diseases, I think it's really important to make sure that you're not killing with kindness. And I mean that the law of unintended consequences. So in rare diseases, I think, as we all know, expertise is rare, the patients are rare, and so are the patient representatives. And so you may end up with a situation where you have one or two real patient experts that may be with the FDA or the EMA, and how we interact with them as a company is important, because we don't want to get into a situation where we put them into a conflict. You can't cross the line, obviously compliance, but also not to unintentionally make patient representatives uneligible to participate in the formal setting. So rare can be an advantage. It can also be very easy to cross the line. And I think organizations like Eurodis and Nord have helped us really navigate that carefully. We don't want to hurt the communities unintentionally.
And Daniel, I mean, at Johnson & Johnson, I mean, such a massive company. I mean, I know that you have, there's an arm of it that actually is consumer-led, because that's the nature of the business. And it might be interesting if you've actually learned any lessons from what they do. But actually, how does a company like Johnson & Johnson, ensure that it's, again, attracting the right voices?
Well, I would, first of all, of course, already take what George and Wills have said. So yes, indeed, you need to be looking at it globally, because patients for every country are important. And as an example, in our R&D, we ask patients to look at our trial protocols, and we have patients from 32 countries looking at protocols. So it's not something that, okay, we found someone in the US or someone in Western Europe and it will do. It's definitely not the case. How do you ensure the right patients? Well, I think there is a very good table of expertise that is put on the UPathy website, but you can find it also at PFMD, where it's clearly said, well, either you are an expert because you know your disease, so you're the patient, and that's fine. You just need to talk about what does it mean to live with your disease, but then you can, and we will more and more need expertise of people knowing their disease, but also knowing how a trial protocol is set up. And the more the solutions become high-tech, and we are in a more individualized treatment, we're going there, the more you will need that expertise. So for us, it's key that we have well-organized patient organizations that can ensure that they still represent the patients of their region, but also who have in-house experts that specialize and say, okay, I'm very good in defending a value proposition at the payer or at the EMA or I'm very good at looking at protocols because I have this experience. And there are many training facilities or training opportunities like UPAT, the European Patient Academy for Therapeutic Innovation, but it's not the only one. We're trying to support everyone to go into these trainings, because as time goes by and as payers and health authorities and regulators will become more interested in hearing from the patient what they really think, well, we need more experts going forward. So for me, Mike, the key to success here is well-organized patient groups that can ensure representation and expertise.
Okay, and a sort of follow-up question, which
I just need to ask, I just want to say to that on top of it, of course, these experts need to be paid, because I know this question came up in the Q&A. Yes, they need to be paid for their time. They are experts and they deserve to be treated as expert and get what we as slang call fair market value, but basically they need to get a reward to the time and the efforts that they have spent. And that needs to be fair. That needs to be in comparison to the country they live in and compared to what an expert HCP would get. Sorry that I had to add that, because I think it's important, it's clear. It's not a non-for-profit activity.
Yeah, and thank you for also keeping an eye on the chat. Makes my life a little bit easier. I'm going to direct this next question to Vanessa, but it kind of follows on from what you were saying, Daniel, about sort of, okay, so having that dialogue and having sort of those patient advocacy groups, etc. But conversely, do pharmaceutical companies, do they also have to have in place a go-to person? That's sort of that point of contact that the patient advocates can, one, reach out to, or what kind of structure needs to be in place, again, just to ensure that there's this, as we've heard, an open, a free dialogue that is authentic. So, Vanessa.
Yeah, sure. Happy to share some thoughts on this. I think the governance structure varies already immensely amongst the bigger pharmaceutical companies. And if you then start looking at the smaller companies, of course, it's a whole different story altogether. George said that there is no dedicated function within their company yet. But I don't think it's so much about how it is organized and who you report into, although that's certainly very interesting as well. But the point that you made is really relevant about the clear lines of communication and having that face of the organization. So at Merck, how it works is that our team, Global Patient Insights and Advocacy, would be the main interface to all international type federations of patient organizations. So we don't directly interface with the local patient groups, let's say in a very specific disease area in a country X, Poland, for example. This would be handled by our local colleagues in Poland for various reasons. One being, of course, the language, but then also better understanding the context, the national context, the very specific needs of the patient community. They differ from country to country. So what we do is we have clear relationship management, basically like key account management for the HCPs as well. We have the same idea applying for the patient organizations at the country level. It is done by the country colleagues. Often, I will have to say, they're doing this as one of many roles that they fulfill, especially in smaller countries. But typically, it would be somebody out of medical affairs or communications, not commercial, for the obvious reasons. And then at the global level, or let's say at least supranational, I mean by this the EU level, the regional umbrella for European level organizations, this would be handled out of our team. And we then have this key contact point, often also at advocacy level, at the patient group level, who are in charge of partnerships, funding, industry relationships. And we think it's really important to maintain this, because going back to my earlier point, when our team was created, we didn't invent patient engagement at Merck. There were already a lot of colleagues engaging at different time points throughout the life cycle with the same patient organization. And I think to be able to have that real meaningful dialogue, it's very important for functions like ours to be able to take a step back and not just think asset by asset, but really think, okay, across the entire spectrum, what are we currently able to offer to the multiple sclerosis community? What are our bigger commitments and the relationship overall? And then we can support the internal teams, making sure that they have the right support and that we can identify the right patient group or patient to provide input into their projects.
Right. So Wills, earlier on, you were sort of saying that, you know, this whole approach has to come from the top. So I was just sort of wondering, what does it look like at Mario?
Yeah, it's certainly led from the top. I believe that we have to encourage people to not only do what we say they shall do, but people are going to look and see what they actually observe happening. I think what was really interesting, lots of very interesting things, but what Vanessa was saying really interesting now from my perspective is that if you're having involvement across an organization and across the development and along the development and then in the different countries, to make sure that it's really connected, I think the idea of having a single person who showed up at patient group meetings and listened carefully and went back, I don't believe that that's really what adds value to the interaction and the dialogue and the collaboration between a patient community and the companies. And I think what Vanessa was just describing, the fact that it's been happening for a long time in big companies and small companies, but there needs to be some kind of coordination. So it's content driven, but somehow coordinated without having a situation where you have one person kind of over in the corner saying, well, that's their job. It's nothing to do with me. I believe this is really, really interesting. And it's also interesting to hear that this has been happening for many, many years, maybe 50 years or more in big companies, and the small companies are trying to embed this as we grow. And so I'm seeing that happening from our CEO, then obviously us and the leadership team. And we're at an early stage though. We're not geographically spread. So I'd say we have an ambition to roll it out. We're at the start. We have the right view, I hope, and I hope our communities will support that. But let's see how we get on. I'll ask them for the scorecard as we get further down the line.
Right, yeah, so the scorecards. Actually, I mean, we've got some other questions coming in, and some of them are sort of fairly related. So I'm going to sort of, try and sort of smash a couple of them together. One is, first, if companies are, looking to, establish, genuinely sustainable, successful sort of patient engagement or patient direction or patient centricity, whatever we want to call it, are there sort of activities or structures that need to be implemented that are must-haves of best practice, and how do you create the right culture and incentivize people, but also where, I mean, I think we've sort of danced around it where people sort of talking about sort of the voice of the patient. I'm just sort of interested to understand, where does the voice of the patient actually have an impact? And it'd be great if somebody could give us an example of where they can actually sort of say that it did move the dial. So what we're going to do is I'm going to sort of kick off with I'll kick off with Vanessa.
Yep. I was just chatting away. I was trying to answer some of the questions in parallel. So I think this is a great question. So for us, we actually just did an exercise within our company where we took the external frameworks and looked at the guidance coming from PFMD, so patient-focused medicines development. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. If not, you can really take a look at their resources. There's a lot of hands-on how-to guides for how to do patient engagement at various different stages. but also UPATI has done a great roadmap that I think will be familiar to many here. And then, of course, there is the Paradigm Toolkit. This is more EU focused now, but still, I think holds true also for organizations not active within the EU. So just mentioning a few really great resources. Now, we looked at them together, of course, also with the FDA guidance on patient-focused drug development, and extracted all the different interaction points, I want to call them, the engagement opportunities identified by these external platforms, networks, and regulators. And we kind of tried to work our way back from, okay, if this is what is externally being proposed as frameworks for patient engagement in pharmaceutical development, what of these are we already doing at Merck? If yes, if not, why are we not doing them? So are some of these must-haves for all companies, for all assets, or are some of these activities maybe more relevant in, I'm just going to say, rare indications, or is some of this not really applicable for smaller startups and biotechs? So we really try to work through this, and we're initially aiming to identify a list of must-have criteria for a patient engagement approach at Merck. But we then came to realize that it has to be a lot more nuanced, because even within the company, we, for example, have a long experience in the space of multiple sclerosis, more than 20 years already active in that community, whereas in others, we're really just starting now through new research in our pipeline. So the approach already to how we engage with the patient community has to be quite different. Now, what was interesting was that I set up a series of interviews with different stakeholders across the organization to also see what others, leaders in R&D, were thinking about the must-have criteria and what would they all agree on. There is no consensus. I think it's really interesting how ultimately there is a lot that we should be doing, but it's still very hard to say, here's the checklist, now go run with it for every single asset that you're moving through your pipeline. And that's just not going to be the reality.
I would like to add, Mike, if I may. So I think I agree with what you said, Vanessa. I'm not going to alter it. I would say there were two questions. One, when does it start, and what is a must-have? And I say, when does it start? It should start before you even have a target product profile. It should start at your strategy. You need to involve patients at the moment you decide where you want to go in a therapeutic area or a disease area. You should co-discuss with patients. Are we going to go from 3 pills a day to 1 pill a day to maybe 1 injection every month? It's a strategic thinking that you not even have compounds for, but you need to have an agreement. The second thing is, and that's not a must-have, but it would be an ideal world. I would love to have patient advocacy boards, community advocacy boards everywhere, mainly advocacy boards organized by the patient community themselves, where they sit at the driving seat and they invite industry members to present at the yearly or bi-yearly rhythm where they are, where they're going. Because I think it makes them really sit in this driving seat. It ensures this follow-up, it ensures this continuity, much more than ad hoc needs that the industry may have. And it's not excluding that ad hoc. And the patient advocacy board is well described in Paradigm. So I can only advocate for everyone who is involved to try to copy paste it.
So I'd like to step in here, just maybe collect a number of points that were raised. It's good to have a psychiatrist on the panel so that I can tell you what behaviors are about. Metrics drive behaviors. Metrics drive behaviors. Whenever you impose something and you say it's must have, I can tell you that it becomes a tick box. People basically are going to pretend or do it just for completeness. It's not going to come from the heart. Leadership, walking the talk, absolutely. Remind people of the upside of engaging with patients. I'll give you a couple of examples. Number one, there is a paper I can share with you where a study was conducted having clinician reported outcomes and patient reported outcomes. All patient reported outcomes came out positive. All clinician reported outcomes were missed. That's a missed opportunity, investment and time. There is a famous advisory committee for oncology that all unanimously voted against the approval of a drug, because despite of the fact that the primary outcome was met, there was no impact on patient quality of life. That's a huge missed opportunity. Reminding people all the time that, every single minute you spend with patients is time well spent, because that's going to be better adherence to your protocol. That's going to be better implementation and execution. It's going to be by far smoother. Patient acceptance and adherence are going to be ideal. Remember always, metrics drive behaviors. We cannot impose, we can only inspire.
So Wills, I mean, you've worked for a number of companies in the rare disease space. So I'm just sort of interested in sort of the engagement, that patient engagement, and how different it is, or are there sort of is there some sort of consensus, right? Even if it's in the rare disease space. So it'd be just kind of interesting just to sort of get or have you been able to actually sort of, take lessons from other places and import them into Mereo?
Well, I mean, I think what George was just saying was absolutely fabulous. This concept of metrics driving behaviors, and it really has to be genuine. It can't be lip service. So again, I think this goes back to this idea of the need for it to be genuine. It needs to come from the top, and the culture. We talk about culture, but how we do things around here, people might read things on a charter, but they actually observe how we do things around here, because we're social creatures. And George, you know this better than me. So we need to it's not my little baby, it's not mine. But he's or she is a young person ready to learn and hopefully go on and be part of the rare disease community, treating patients. So I think how we do things around here, and a need to recognize and reward that. What I've noticed is that consistently across the 3 rare disease companies I've had the privilege to work at, we invite people from the communities to come and talk to the whole company, as I mentioned earlier. And this has been led by the CEO. And this was the same at Genzyme under Henry Tamir, who's no longer with us, God rest him. During the time at Sobi under Jeff McDonough, where he was bringing people from the hemophilia community and other communities in to talk to the board. So the people that were responsible for the investment were actually really having connection, real live connection with the communities we were seeking to serve. And this is something that Denise is leading through Mereo. So I think that's a major lesson. And to go back to George, metrics drive behavior, and it has to be real, because people will smell it out when it's not real. And be that the communities or the people that we're trying to invite to be part of our companies.
Yeah, so it's interesting because so taking on board those comments, and also what Vanessa said earlier on about not actually being able to create a playbook for patient centricity. So how do you, what are the metrics or the KPIs do you use to actually demonstrate that you're being successful with your patient centricity? What can you measure or should you measure? And importantly, because the pharmaceutical companies are not charities, there has to be a return on investment. I can imagine that there could be individuals who see this is a cost rather than an investment. So first, if you could just stress the sort of the metrics. So Vanessa, I am interested in sort of the metrics that you do use, and then if others could sort of jump in with any thoughts, and then maybe I'll do the return, give the return on investment to the big company in the room. So Vanessa.
Yeah, no, I think it's just important to to think about this in small, how do you eat an elephant? You don't eat the whole elephant all at once. You have to actually break it down. And I wouldn't eat an elephant, just for clarity. But I think with patient engagement being such a big topic, of course, the return on engagement is a huge question. There has been a lot of literature. There are some very interesting publications. I'm very happy to share some of that afterwards also here, where there really have been specific measurements of how, there is faster regulatory approval, that there is improved sort of reimbursement and pricing decision making because of better patient value being demonstrated. There are also really figures around treatment choice, prescribers more willing to prescribe a certain product if they perceive it more in line with patient needs. There is data around the adherence. I think we've all heard about that. Patient experience, patient convenience. There is a lot of data out there if you look in the literature, and of course, patient safety aspects as well. But I do want to say that if we are talking about this at a company at a very operational level, the key is really to break it down into what does it mean for all the different project teams involved. Going back to what I was saying earlier, it's not an abstract. There are specific tasks at hand, be that target value profile, be that clinical protocol, be that materials that we need to be reviewed and understood by the users, an app that we're trying to launch in conjunction with a pharmaceutical and needs to be tested. I mean, the patient engagement at the end of the day translates into very specific activities and very specific goals that we need to achieve in those different projects. And so that is where it's relevant to make sure that those patient centricity goals are embedded from the start and that they are measured. It all goes back to accountability, which then takes me back to the question, of course, of budgets, of enabling teams, of making sure that this is part of their personal objectives, even in their annual objective setting and their reward scheme or reward structure that Will's also mentioned for their company. So I think at the end of the day, a lot is out there in the literature about the big return on engagement that you think might be at the sort of at the forefront, but ultimately at the end of the day, I see it just being equally important to break it down bit by bit into all the different projects and activities. How can we do a better job here?
Yeah, I agree with Vanessa, and before I took the ROI, because I know you want me to mention that, I agree with you completely. We want people in our company to look at their own function and to come with their own KPI. What does it bring to me? Am I better in my medical education to my doctors? Am I faster in my trials? So it should be meaningful for everyone, and that's the KPI we use. But I still want to mention that big elephant in the room. Healthcare is under real constraints, and we all need healthcare as an industry because we're part of it, as a patient because we need solutions, and as a payer, as a taxpayer, I want better outcomes. So if we involve patients in clinical trials, the trials will be more efficient, faster, and will come with innovation faster. If patients are involved in the development of the solutions, they're more empowered, and there are articles that show that an empowered patient does well, does better off, so it's better healthcare. So that means we're getting, for the same investment as a taxpayer, more health outcomes. We're making healthcare more sustainable. We should not mention the elephant, but we should put it in little slices, as Vanessa suggested, with KPIs. We've published an article, Bennett Levitan et al. At DIA, I will send the link, which basically calculated from a model only in R&D, so only in the clinical trial setting. We're not even talking about the rest of the life cycle of a product. By engaging with patients. So if you would invest 100,000, the return is a 500-fold. So if you are still facing some people who doubt, who are asking this question, there is no question. You put this article in front of these people and say, okay, show me anything else that you can invest in, and that brings you a 500-fold return. Honestly, I don't think there is many things left for us to do than to engage more with patients in the future.
Right. Thanks very much, Daniel, and thanks for sharing that article on ROI. I think the audience will really appreciate that. So we've completely run out of time. I mean, it's just this has been a fantastic conversation. I've tried to incorporate some of the questions from the audience. Owing to time constraints, obviously we haven't been able to include them all, So some remain unanswered, but we will make an effort to get answers to the audience. As I say, this webinar is part of some work that we're doing at Clarivate to try and sort of help stakeholders establish, what a truly patient ecosystem might look like, what that framework should be. So I'd also invite anybody who wishes to have a contribution to that, just to email me. It's michael.ward@clarivate.com. A recording of this event will be sent out to everyone who's registered, either later this week or early next week. And if you're interested in furthering your learning around some patient-centric topics, for example, apart from obviously the content that we'll be producing, you may wish to tune into this upcoming Pharma and Patient USA meeting that Reuters Events is hosting next month, or in November, and you can check out the details on this slide. So finally, it's my pleasure to thank each of our panelists for taking the time today to share their thoughts on this, what is clearly a very important subject. So thank you, George, Wills, Vanessa, and Daniel.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.